Welcome to this very special antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel. For the next hour, we go live to our great leader, Joseph Robinette Biden, directly from his souped-up basement in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and hopefully soon to his vice president, Kamala
Davy Harris.
Davy Harris. Off with your head, Greg.
I believe it's Davy Harris, actually.
Davy, you're right. All right.
Kamala Davy Harris.
Off to the gulags for both of us.
Anyhow, we are. That was a. We'll explain what that intro was the intention of that was for in a moment. But needless to say, we're not here to praise our overlord Biden. But that's a playoff of something we're going to be going back to here in a moment, as the Russian president Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I don't know how good my accent is.
Here, should I play the intro the way that it actually went down?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, here we go.
Without further ado, delivered today, here is Russian President Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address. Let's get into it.
Join Sputnik News for a special broadcast.
Vladimir Putin.
All right, so that's actually how it went down this morning on Sputnik Radio.
And that was from the morning Sputnik Radio Sputnik program, Faultlines. That was Shane Stranahan introducing the Vladimir Putin speech, and Sputnik, which of course is Russian propaganda operating in America, right here in Kansas City on on KCXL, which is 1140 AM, which is the traditional conspiracy theory radio station here in Kansas City. So, that was the introduction to Vladimir Putin. Basically, was that the Russian equivalent of the State of the Union address?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And basically proceeded to play the whole speech before bringing on a trio of Lee Stranahan, Michael Maloof, and Mark Sloboda, basically to act as propagandists, if not outright cheerleaders, which is everything like the American media is said to do, like anytime like there's a State of the Union address or anytime the president speaks. And on one hand, there's nothing wrong with getting a foreign perspective on matters. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But on the other hand, the way it's used, I mean, we've talked about our views on the nature of like nefarious foreign state propaganda operating here domestically, and we'll get into reasons why, a couple of reasons why this particular outing or offering of explanations of the official state business of the Russian state through its media here in the U.S. why this particular presentation was problematic to us. So.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it too is the intent of it. It's not like good faith external critique of the country, hiring just good faith American dissidents to take on the worst aspects of their own country and government. But you just go and look at the graphic of the show. Continues to be Faultlines. This was handed down by Lee Stranahan ultimately
from the divided states of America.
And people like Lee Stranahan helped divide the United States of America. He played a small little role, but you look at the graphic and it's the same graphic. It's this sort of apocalyptic wasteland, sort of meant to be some kind of nondescript American city. Maybe it's the capital, but there's a massive split, a fault line. The earth is breaking apart. There's a very gray sky, a very ominous sky, and lightning striking down here. So it's not, it's not sort of like straightforward criticism, critical analysis, recovering from a Russian perspective. It doesn't feel like that.
It's not as overt as the program that Margarita Simonyan, is she still the head of RT currently, or she?
I'm not sure.
But Margarita Simonian, who was in a head position at RT America, the program that she hosted, which we'll have to find the link and put that in our show notes of the logo for her program, which was basically it was Washington Capitol on fire, correct? If I recall correctly.
Oh, I totally forgot that. Maybe she could hook up with Nancy Pelosi, and they could all. So Russia from Israel could celebrate as the American capital was crumbling.
The global organized crime syndicate's interests behind a lot of this chaos would mutually be happy with their particularly what Nancy Pelosi actually said about the one thing that would be kept intact if the Capitol burned down would be our support for Israel. So
that would be an interesting graphic for someone to work on. Would be that Simonian view of the American Capitol in ruins, with Nancy Pelosi on stage with Haim Saban and the Schumer of the Senate, with making sure that in the background the walls that divide occupied Palestine from Israel Palestine are fully standing, and Jerusalem is at the commanding heights. Then everyone can be happy except for the Americans, I guess.
And so I guess I'll get into the reasons for singling out this Sputnik presentation of the. Well, I mean, I just saw this on my podcast this morning, and when I saw the description for it, I thought, uh-oh. And so anyway, the reason for thinking that is because and we've talked about, particularly, we're going to go back to discussing one of the individuals that we already mentioned, Lee Stranahan, and the role, and basically, I believe he's played is from within the Breitbart Mercer network of propaganda, working to help perpetuate the divided states of America. Everything from the working with Andrew Breitbart and Steve Bannon to head the course of like the exaggerated and weaponized opposition to Occupy Wall Street, on to things that were going on the lead up to the 2016 election, creating hysteria about migrant rape gangs in Idaho, to going to Radio Sputnik. But the other and even bigger problem in terms of like an actual a nature of a real issue with this overtly foreign perspective on the overtly Russian perspective on this on a speech by the head of the Russian state on a state propaganda outlet that runs here in the U.S. was the presence of somebody we've discussed before, and I'm sure we'll probably discuss again in the future, and that is Michael Maloof, the veteran of the post 9/11 propaganda wars, right at the forefront with some of the neocons that operated out of Dick Cheney's inner circle within what's known as the Office for Special Plans. Doug Feith and David Wormser in particular, and there are others. But Radio Sputnik is bringing on Michael Maloof specifically to discuss the foreign policy aspects of Vladimir Putin's the equivalent of the American State of the Union address, and presenting Maloof as just a principled State Department veteran who has a principled
Pentagon, a security veteran professional with lots of experience.
Yes, that was the description. Yes, Pentagon. But with years of experience, but the idea that this is coming just simply from like the strictly principled American point of view, as far as like a principled like American critique of foreign policy, of geopolitics. And when you look at, I mean, we've talked about Maloof before, and we'll talk about it again. Like, I think when you look at it, and it's really, I think it shapes up to be anything but that, with a combination of his history, of the of his background and the types of people he's been involved with, also going from Office of Special Plans to World Net Daily and then to RT, and then the still, I'd say, like less than regretful or apologetic stance he takes to this present day on the operations he was involved in the lead up particularly to the Iraq War.
Well, it's not even clear. It's not even clear he's even ever been directly asked about it in public. I don't think we've seen any direct questioning of his specific role in the run-up to the Iraq War in the Office of Special Plans. I don't think we've even seen the question being posed. Maybe I'm wrong, but
he's very relatively unknown. He flies under the radar even compared to these other nest of neocons such as Feith and Wormser, and then of course Richard Pearl as well, the Prince of Darkness as he's called. I mean, even they, as much as under the radar as they fly, I mean, Maloof is obscure even compared to them. So I think you're correct about that. But
and Maloof was worked under Pearl actually for a while. Greg, what if I'll just play the introduction to that segment. We won't go through all of it, but we'll just hear the introduction.
Yes, let's do that.
Looking at the foreign policy implications of what Putin said in about his last 20 minutes there, talking about Ukraine, Belarus, the attempted coup in Belarus, the how that lines up with what happened in Ukraine in 2014 with the U.S.-backed overthrow of the Yanukovych government and the installation of Petro Poroshenko. We're going to be going over all that stuff and in some depth. But as anybody who listened to this whole thing heard, that wasn't where Putin focused his attention. He focused the vast majority of his speech, his time, and his emphasis on domestic issues, on the economy, on technology, on education, like we were just talking about. And first and foremost, he started
sounds like any American president's speech
and COVID and how Russia has dealt with that and plans to continue to deal with that. Also, economic relief, rebalancing loans, other things. But my point here is, at least 3/4 of it, by time alone, was by my math, was spent on domestic issues, which if there's one thing that I want to impress on the audience as we go into a break, even though we're coming back on foreign policy, that was not where Putin focused his attention. But we need to go into a break. You're listening to Faultlines.
Real quick, Shane. Real quick.
What's up?
First article.
All right. I think that they introduced the guest before that. But you hear the sort of the way the segment is introduced there.
Yeah. We're going to be going to the foreign policy elements of this in just a couple of minutes with our next guest. We're going to be joined by Michael Maloof and Lee Stranahan, looking at the foreign policy implications of what Putin said in about his last 20 minutes there.
There we go. And that's how they introduced why they were bringing these two Sputnik experts to the next segment.
Yes, and so it's interesting. Like even the way, like I guess, was that their way of saying Putin's not obsessed with not obsessed with foreign policy, and Russia has no interest in negatively affecting anybody else, is the fact that he focused the majority of his speech on domestic policy. I mean, American presidents devote most of their speeches to domestic policy. I mean,
right. Well, I mean that this is the legitimate, part of the foreign-based press. Trying to explain to an American audience where there will be an emphasis and a weaponized emphasis on the quote unquote foreign policy that will be seen, probably legitimately so, in some way as belligerent. And so that's them saying, look, Putin was not spending the entire time railing against the West or talking about his red lines and all of that. He spent most of it just like an American president would in attending to domestic policy interests.
Fair enough on that regard. I think that you're not wrong on that. I guess my thought is that, like, if this was the way, like we've seen, like the way particularly Russian state media that is stationed here in the West operates and is intended for Western audience operates. And this is not to say that American, establishment media is not guilty of a lot of the same things much of the time, is this emphasis on all the things America's trying to do to basically hurt everybody else in the world that doesn't want to go along with it. And of course, there is a serious layer of truth to that, also with a weaponized layer as well. But a combination of that and how, like, even the domestic aspects of the speech are designed, all these policies that are going to hurt the citizenry and all this. So it is a full on criticism of both domestic and foreign politics. And so I guess my thing is that the emphasis is primarily on domestic policy as opposed to foreign policy, and the media gets obsessed with that. But I think when it's our politicians in these platforms, like, it's very much like it's the sky is falling globally, and domestically they're doing everything to hurt their citizens here. So, which of course is not entirely untrue, but it's
no. And the main reason that we focus on this is not to play whataboutism or comparative compromise of the domestic presses in terms of the United States versus Russia, or the different information operations that each governments are playing against the other. But we really are focused in terms of the fakeness or the fraudulent aspect that is indicated in terms of the way that these programs on this foreign state media apparatus are presented as quote unquote dissident alternative media types, and to look at what it might mean that someone like Maloof is brought in to be like for their flagship morning show to address the Western and American audiences about the Putin speech. And of course, he's playing some kind of role. He keeps on talking about his sources, not clear who his sources are, where his sources are, but he's just referencing sources in terms of his justification or explanation for Putin's maneuvers and communications and all of that. But meanwhile, we want to focus on the fact that you informed the co-host of this show, Jamarl Thomas, who's there, helping introduce Maloof and helps, do the whole show and the segment. You, Greg, just, end of 2020, pointed out with references to Militarist Monitor, I think, of the background of Michael Maloof. And Jamarl Thomas basically said that he was going to look into it, ask him about it next time. We can't find any evidence that ever happened. It definitely never happened on this show. And meanwhile, Michael Maloof remains this same very dubious sus character in terms of his role in the Faith operation and the Office of Special Plans and the Pentagon cell, the attached Pentagon cell. So we will move to, we want to cover both, remind folks about what was going on RT between Phil Giraldi and Michael Maloof as they discussed the deep state and the intelligence coup and how disingenuous and directly like what you would call black propaganda that Maloof was pushing readily and Giraldi was not even pushing back on. And so that's part of what we wanted to touch on, while also pointing out that there was no reason for serious journalists or analysts to be putting Michael Maloof on without questioning him ever about this very, very dubious background. Based on the worst of what they would say of the American empire in terms of the Iraq War. And here's a guy who helped create this thing for the quote unquote the American empire.
Very true. And you had a combination there that you mentioned in this RT interview that we're going to, I think, play an excerpt from of Michael Maloof and Phil Giraldi, two American in the case of or veterans in terms of like their respective communities. Maloof comes out of like more Pentagon circles, obviously Phil Giraldi straight out of CIA, and two individuals who have been connected and are into the Iranian New Horizon conference. That's another thing to keep in mind. But on the note of just mentioning I did reach out to, actually I tagged in a tweet after Maloof was on Faultlines in early December of 2020, just this past year. Faultlines radio account, Shane Stranahan, Progressive Soapbox, that's the account of Jamarl Thomas, that's the name of his program he hosts independently of Faultlines, and Sputnik International. And I presented some links. I mentioned a couple of Militarist Monitor links on the Office of Special Plans in Michael Maloof, as well as a Daily Cost link about the Office of Special Plans, and also a link to an article from New York Magazine from 2004 by Franklin Foer, which identifies Michael Maloof as being the primary source of Judith Miller, of course, the infamous Judith Miller of Weapons of Mass Destruction, New York Times, front page propaganda infamy. So I put that out there, and Jamarl Thomas's response to me at the time was, I will absolutely bring this up. And in fairness, I mean, I don't know if they interviewed him any other time. I'm quite certain that this has not come up on air, but at the very least, I mean, it's less than half a year after this information, I guess, affected Jamarl Thomas. I don't know if he's just unaware of Maloof's history, if he had no idea coming into it, but to the point where he said he will bring this up the next time Maloof is booked or scheduled to be on their show. And, I responded to him. I don't see any evidence of this being the case, that this did happen. And if there's any evidence to the contrary, or if it did happen, maybe off the record, maybe Thomas could clear that up. But something like this needs to be done, I believe, on the record, especially at the level of somebody like a Maloof. Even if Maloof's had some genuine, like, come to Jesus moments of, like, which I don't see the evidence for in terms of, like, his past work, as you talked about. Even then, it's still, like, something that still needs to be hashed out on a platform that you're directly welcoming him on, presenting him as an expert of a principled critique of American foreign policy while it's in geopolitics, while it's being done on a foreign state propaganda network.
Especially as, like, Lee Stranahan was doing tons of, like, all right, there's Biden calls Putin a killer, and the U.S. accuses Russia of assassinations, but everybody knows the American history of assassinations, back to the Cold War. And obviously very real history, very important history. But what's so interesting is if you really were trying to do some serious, like, look at this hypocrisy from the American, imperial pigs pushing on Putin, with a total lack of integrity, you'd go to, remember the Iraq War that led to the death of probably over 1 million people directly? Here's a guy to comment on Putin, who's not a killer's speech, who helped do that, but he's apologized in order to expose the belly of the American imperial beast. No, none of that. Even if he had apologized, they would have brought it up again and put him front and center, almost as like a John,
he would be
almost like a
presented as
John
a reform.
Perkins, like a John Perkins type or something like that.
And on quick note, just mention with regards to Lee Stranahan, I mean, it's interesting still, he comes from that background of being, as he claims to be, he was Andrew Breitbart's best friend, and he was, they were obviously really close to talk, it's documented their work together in terms of attempting to discredit Occupy Wall Street, and on from there. And remember, Stranahan does come out of a network that was so passionately pro-Israel to a point of being critical of the American political establishment, for foreign policy establishment, for not being supportive enough of Israel, that this network that he comes out of set up an office in Jerusalem headed by, an American citizen who actually moved to Israel, and I believe is now currently serving under Netanyahu as a communications advisor, of course, that being Aaron Klein. And so, he comes out of this network, and it's very interesting. I still point out, and I would have loved to have had a conversation with Stranahan about this. I mean, he blocked me on Twitter months ago, and he actually, very interestingly, I had technical issues, quote unquote, when I tried to call into the backstory with Stranahan and John Kiriakou a couple months back. But ultimately, this is still, I will point this out about Stranahan before we move on, this is still in line with, like, his former network that he comes out of, the Breitbart network, of doing as much as possible to just discredit, a combination of discrediting, like, the American foreign policy community, as well as the whole Bannon line of flooding the zone with shit to in the effort to destroy the American administrative state, and so it's very much still in line, now that it's coming from, like, this Russian centric point of view. It's still very much in line with, and this of course goes back to, perhaps there could be a common bit of a kinship maybe with a Michael Maloof, who comes out of a combination of WorldNet Daily and out of the original, as you talked about, the original the Scoop Jackson neocon Richard Pearl, and then a couple of his proteges, Wormser and Feith. So I mean, this is all still a pipeline that there's still a lot of continuity between, like, even Stranahan's old network that he was associated with and this new one, and I would love to have hashed out at some point, but I just wanted to throw that in as well.
Yeah, and so I'd like to read just a tiny bit from the Mother Jones article, The Lie Factory, that we've referenced a whole bunch, but maybe what we should do is actually play the RT clip. I mean, it's not that long ago, so I think it's virtually impossible, unless there was some kind of big revelation with Maloof sometime at the very last, like, New Horizon conference or something like that I'm definitely not aware of that ever happening. Here is what he was actually saying in terms of who was at fault for the quote unquote deep state's role in the Iraq War. And this is 2019. This is on the show, The Big Picture on RT. All right. Is that cool if I play this now, Greg? And then we'll go to some of the Lie Factory.
Yes, that's great. And by the way, the title of the video, I'll just read it real quick, has the U.S. intelligence community compromised by political bias? And the date is May 3rd, 2019. So this is just under 2 years ago.
All right. So I'm going to start a little bit before the 3-minute mark here. All right, here we go. 2:46.
It doesn't necessarily influence their analysis. If you look at the other major part of the CIA, which is the clandestine service, which is where I worked, CIA spies are a lot more pragmatic, and CIA spies tend to be very conservative. So characterizing the whole agency in a certain way is probably inappropriate. But the people at the top are political. And the ones at the top that are political are the ones that we were just talking about.
And by the way, what we missed here was in the beginning of his answer about this question of the politicization of the intelligence community and the deep state. And as they'll get into, he points out in the front end that the analyst class at the CIA tend to be, I think he calls them liberal Democrats. And then he said he distinguishes them from the actual covert operators, the clandestine community, who he says are much more pragmatic rather than political, I think is the point that he's making here. So let's see how this ends up.
Right.
They're in it for their own agenda. They're in it for their own success, their own careers.
Well, we are all only human, and we all have our biases. Michael, based on your time at the Pentagon, would you characterize those people, the crew cuts in uniform I see at the Pentagon stop on Metro, as validating the stereotype that military people skew politically right?
Well, they are.
I didn't know Michael Makovsky had a crew cut. He probably did, though.
Conservative, but now being in the Pentagon, I was a consumer of the intelligence that is generated from the.
He was just a custy. He was a poor little, just a consumer. He was a retail customer. They were just trying. He and his buddies were just trying to get the thing right, and he was just consuming at a retail level this IC stuff
from the agencies and at the CIA. And the thing is that what consumer of the intelligence that is generated from the agencies and at the CIA. And the thing is that what we saw was that analysts themselves were good. They really worked with the facts. But as their analysis rose to the top, the analysis became more and more politicized. And I saw this in 2002 when I was there, when George Tenet presented to George Bush this slam dunk evidence that he claims about WMD in Iraq. And I knew from the work that I did at my office that they didn't have the operation.
Wait, which office was it? Why didn't he say what his office was? Which office was that?
Good question.
So he sort of skips a lot of history here.
Yeah.
WMD that he claimed that they had. And we saw that because Tenet was Democrat, my view was that he was actually setting George Bush up for failure.
Wow.
From a policy standpoint.
Wow. This is like the counter of the Wesley Clark policy coup. This was a deep state. This is like Q. This is to resonate almost with like, remember, this is RT post-Trump or in the midst of Trump's administration. So this is where they eventually turned to, which was really about bolstering the entirety of the political culture and ideology that had enabled Trump and that continued to enable him while he was in office. And so this is very much, you can hear this as the deep state demon rat coup trying to, in that case, it was George W. Bush, who I thought was also a part of the deep state. But this is a more nuanced take on that archetype, I'd say.
Real quick, that's very similar to I did a solo show probably a little over a year ago about Rush Limbaugh doing a similar argument that the same deep state Democrats that are trying to remove Trump from office tricked Bush into going to war in Iraq through the faulty intelligence. So, I mean, you got Michael Maloof on Russian state television making the same argument as the now deceased #1 American media propagandist of the Bush era crimes. So.
Well, that's so interesting, Greg, and I'm glad you brought that in, because then you see the actual nature of that part of the propaganda horseshoe, where it goes from the AM talk radio, Fox News, Connected, Rush Limbaugh, through the RT, reformed, quote unquote, neocon Michael Maloof, all the way into the Trump Q culture.
And Philip Giraldi would be very much considered to be, I think, more of a paleo conservative more than anything else. So that's like the more traditional, like, America first kind of non-interventionist view on things. So
and
all of that,
it looks like, and it's almost like Giraldi's there to give the stamp of like approval from a sort of, standard paleo conservative point of view, and his take on it is much more honest and rational to some extent, and it's almost like he's just there to give the stamp of approval to Maloof's crazy black propaganda.
And Giraldi, it's interesting because would you agree that Giraldi is one of the most maybe quote unquote serious critics of, say, U.S. policy towards Israel and the power of the Israel lobby domestically to come out of his community of intelligence, but at the same time, like, his whole thing is all about, like, how on one hand, like, the Israel lobby has all this power, yet the neocons are just simply obsessed with, like, going to war with Russia and all this. It's very much emblematic of, like, this entire sphere, this entire community, that, like, everything is all about, like, how much the pro-Israel neocons have it in for Russia, but never talk about obviously the very well documented and provable facts of Donald Trump being the combination of Donald Trump being going on seems close to 4 decades asset, if not outright agents of Russian intelligence and organized crime syndicate, combined with very real hostile measures as far as, like, domestically and actual activities that it appears the Russian state has been perpetuating to advance the same global war on terror that all of these people are so quick to decry when it comes to simply, like, making the United States look bad. So very much Giraldi, to say the least, misses the boat on a lot of things in his simple narrative of Israel lobby controls everything, but is also controlled by neocons who just want to hurt Russia. So.
And it is very interesting on that point that even in their discussion today, that I think it was Lee Stranahan, but it was in between he and Maloof, that they made a serious effort to emphasize who was back in power was a Kagan girl, Victoria Nuland. But meanwhile, here's Phil Giraldi sitting next to an actual, neocon operative who actually helped architect, very likely was in the circle that actually operatively architected the initiation of the war in Iraq, probably much more than the sort of think tank pieces of Robert Kagan.
And helped to push the heavy propaganda, which could have led to something serious going down in Iran in the last days of the Bush administration, which appears to have actually been stood down. So.
And it is the case that Giraldi, like for a lot of the 21st century, is sort of seen as the top, handful of U.S. intelligence veterans critical of the U.S. relationship with Israel and Israeli espionage and the industrial scale of all of that. And I was always a little bit suspicious of him because of his standoffishness and of apparent silence on basically most any serious aspect of September 11th, and how that might have tied in then very directly to Israeli intelligence. And that's so obvious that for a serious critic of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship to be silent on that, there's something going on there, and of course there could be many things for it, but it was the first indicator to me that there is an issue here with the nature of the Giraldi's approach, and which just becomes more and more clear as he's now here on RT sitting next to a an Iraq War operative, and watch how he lets him spin it even some more here. Watch this.
That he was actually setting George Bush up for failure.
Wow.
He being George Tenet.
Yep. Here, I'll back it up. We can hear that again.
Because Tenet was Democrat. My view.
Tenet was Democrat. You remember what was actually like that, you know, if it's true what was being written in Seeds of Fire about what Tenet was actually coming into as a holdover as the director of Central Intelligence into the George W. Bush administration was actually in his briefing book. Remember that? We were talking about, you know, Israeli intelligence linked up with the Russian mob in a European context to buy black market nuclear material. There was the question of Semyon Mogilevich and the money laundering. There was the question of China and Israel working in an intelligence conjoinment operation in relationship to penetrating Los Alamos and Division X and the secret drives of the NEST, the secret nuclear bomb squad that was out of the country for the first time in 3 years for September 11th, for when Lower Manhattan went ground zero on all of that, you know, and so that all of that is actually what it looks like is what was on Tenet's plate in terms of this. And yes, ultimately Tenet signs off on the whole thing, and we still don't have a great explanation of how all of that went down. But I can guarantee you it's not Tenet, the Democrat, trying to set up, along with the deep state, George W. Bush. All right, let's listen to this again.
Was that he was actually setting George Bush up for failure.
Wow.
From a policy standpoint, because they had assets that they did not want to have hampered or compromised in Iraq, and they also had other agendas.
A second agenda.
Yes, and we see that today in many respects.
I'll just tell you, like, that Giraldi's cheeks are flushing at this point. He does a very strange mouth motion, like he's sitting there, you know, taking this. He's giving his stamp on this. This is total malarkey.
With regard to this deep state thing that you referred to,
right.
they are basically a government unto themselves. And that's that is what has emerged.
You know who else is a government unto themselves? The government of Israel that your guys were working for and with. That's also a government unto itself.
And they can. I remember James Woolsey told me one time that
your buddy, was he your buddy? It sounds like. Listen to this.
His operational side basically slow rolled him. He could not get them to do anything.
Oh, very interesting nugget of intelligence here. I bet Giraldi actually could explain it. Basically, Maloof says that Woolsey, that the operations people slow rolled Woolsey. All right, knowing what we know about Woolsey after the fact. Woolsey, another guy at the epicenter of the neocons who were really the ones who pushed the post 9/11
and ostensibly people who, you know, are friendly to, like, you know, the Russian state and want, like, better geopolitical relations probably should not be championing, considering he's trying to claim now absurdly that Soviet Union ordered Oswald to kill Kennedy. So
exactly. All right, so I'll try to not make as many comments here. We'll let this play out. But listen to this James Woolsey stuff here. I mean, because I can imagine, think about what we know about James Woolsey, about what that might mean, that the operations people were slow rolling him. They probably were, because he was involved in some really, really shady shit that he was trying to pop off and get off the ground. And they were probably slow rolling him, just like certain smarter Pentagon people were slow rolling Donald Trump about his worst shit.
They can. I remember James Woolsey told me one time that his operational side basically slow rolled him. He could not get them to do anything.
Good.
And even though he was Clinton's appointee, he was also a conservative. He was from the Pentagon.
A neoconservative, in fact.
And he said the few times that he could brief Clinton, didn't happen very often, and he would joke about how that helicopter that crashed into the White House was one of his attempts to get in to
was that a
the
terrorist
president.
Gallows humor. Hey, it was recently reported
humor.
that President Trump called President Carter for advice on something, and despite past political acrimony, ex-presidents have traditionally been a fraternal brain.
Okay, very interesting story, very badly told by Maloof.
Yeah, this is something that we have identified this before in terms of we've even talked about, like, the neocon split as we've identified, but also this even goes outside of that, where, like, very, say what you want. Once again, this is not an endorsement of, like, the American foreign policy establishment. I mean, particularly the, you're not here, but you think about it though, there are very serious elements within the American foreign policy establishment. Some might call them realists, some might call them other terms, that have been really within intelligence circles and national defense that have done exactly what Michael Maloof sympathetically characterized as having been done to James Woolsey, and slow-rolled because, like, history shows that this network of operatives, particularly here, and there's other, like, this particular nest of, neoconservatives that has pushed some very obviously to say heavy disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, deadly propaganda. I mean, is it's an understatement. So, like, as you said, like this lamenting about Woolsey being slow rolled as if this proves their case that there is a democratic deep state plot against, like, a righteous foreign policy. Well, in this aspect, no, it does not help your case, Mr. Maloof.
No, it does not. All right, Greg, can I read through some of this Mother Jones Lie Factory?
Yeah, let's go for it, and then and then when we're maybe towards the end, I'll comment on their focus on the Ukrainian aspect of things. Yes, let's go through some of this article here.
Okay, the Mother Jones Factory, Mother Jones, the Lie Factory article, written by Jason Vest and Robert Dreyfus. All right, well, we're going to go up to sort of a little bit down here. All right. Quote, just after September 11th, 2001, Feith and Rode recruited David Wormser, the director of Middle East Studies for AEI, to serve as a Pentagon consultant. Wormser would be the founding participant of the unnamed secret intelligence unit at the Pentagon, set up in Feith's office, which would be the nucleus of the Defense Department's Iraq disinformation campaign that was established within weeks of attacks in New York and Washington. A side note, I thought Maloof said it was the CIA as the analysis went up the chain. It was at the CIA where the Democrats were pushing this. This sounds like it was out of where he was working, the Pentagon, in Feith's office. All right, back to the text. Quote, while the CIA and other intelligence agencies concentrated on Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda as the culprit in the 9/11 attacks, Wolfowitz and Feith obsessively focused on Iraq. It was a theory that was discredited, even ridiculed among intelligence professionals. Daniel Benjamin, co-author of The Age of Sacred Terror, was director of counterterrorism at the National Security Council in the late 1990s. Quote, in 1998, we went through every piece of intelligence we could find to see if there was a link between al-Qaeda and Iraq, he says. We came to the conclusion that our intelligence agencies had it right. There was no noteworthy relationship between al-Qaeda and Iraq. I know that for a fact, unquote. Indeed, that was the consensus among virtually all anti-terrorism specialists. In short, Wormser, backed by Feith and Rode, set out to prove what didn't exist. In an administration devoted to the notion of, quote, Feith-based intelligence, unquote, Wormser was ideal. For years, he'd been a shrill ideologue, part of the minority crusade during the 1990s that was beating the drums for war against Iraq. Along with Pearl and Feith, in 1996, Wormser and his wife, Meirav, wrote a provocative strategy paper for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. It called on Israel to work with Jordan and Turkey to, quote, contain, destabilize, and roll back, unquote, various states in the region, overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq, press Jordan to restore a scion of the Hashemite dynasty to the Iraqi throne, and above all, launch military assaults against Lebanon and Syria as a, quote, prelude to a redrawing of the map of the Middle East, which would threaten Syria's territorial integrity, unquote.
Real quick, what was mentioned up there above, like once again, this is the classic example of the failure of the American institutions to get to the bottom of what's really going on here. Because on one hand, you rightly call out their claims of Iraq, but like on the other hand, like the Al-Qaeda, the idea of Al-Qaeda being responsible for 9/11 continues on, just simply mentioned as if it's just like gospel truth. And once again, it's this failure, inability, or unwillingness, and in a lot of cases probably unwillingness when you consider, Mother Jones and outlets like that, to actually get to the bottom of and really attempt to like dig through and beneath what actually seems to have taken place on September 11th and the events surrounding it. So once again, this is just that staggering and the reason why like the ability to see through the lies about Iraq would be much more visible, I think, if like there was an attempt to really try to dig through the actual propaganda. This is Al-Qaeda, this group of Muslim radical terrorists was responsible for September 11th. So that's once again just another classic example of this mentality that is everywhere. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and it was that entire structure of treasonous fraud, of the continuity of the September 11th deception that created the basin for the structure of Barack Obama's war criminality and treason ultimately, and how no matter whether he was, trying to set up, American positions in some of these global trade agreements, as we talked about when we read through McCoy's article about the Trump era and American people waking up to find the American power gone, or put any little pushback on the Israelis, including on up to signing off on something like Stuxnet and the first major state-sponsored cyber attack that was unleashed alongside the Israelis. That none of that came to any serious effect. He became responsible for thousands of humans' deaths and did not really secure the American position. And I would say that a lot of it was based on the combination of what we talked about before, the unwillingness to actually go back, do truth and accountability at first and foremost. And so that was all then covered up and then doubled down upon, and then selling his sort of outsider, his relationship as an political outsider, as the wars, the CFR Richard Haas's sponsored rhetoric of wars of choice, wars of necessity, and so that it was Afghanistan, which was the source of September 11th, and that Iraq was the war of necessity, and then Iraq was a war of choice, the good war and the bad war, and all of that. And so you're right, Greg, that this is the epicenter of the quote unquote failure of the American establishment. Of course, parts of the American establishment were involved very obviously in September 11th. Or they knew about it. They definitely knew about it after the fact. And so cowardice, from the best it could be called cowards, and the worst could be called traitors, is what it looks like at this point. And that's why I was always suspicious of this, this position of Giraldi of, pointing to Israeli espionage, but somehow missing the point about the Israeli intelligence white vans with the explosives who were caught apparently trying to escalate what had already happened to the World Trade Center and the human beings in them in terms of being basically vaporized. So that you're right, Greg, this is a nagging wound that I still don't see any way out other than through the truth of that.
And it's why, as time goes on, September 11th and the truth about it becomes, as far as I'm concerned, more important as time goes on. I mean,
I agree. All right, back to the article, The Lie Factory. Quote, in 1997, Wormser wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal called, quote, Iraq Needs a Revolution, unquote, and the next year co-signed a letter with Pearl calling for all-out U.S. support of the Iraqi National Congress, INC, an exile group led by Ahmad Chalabi in promoting an insurgency in Iraq. At AEI, Wormser wrote Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Defeat Saddam Hussein, essentially a book-length version of A Clean Break that proposed an alliance between Jordan and the INC to redraw the map of the Middle East. Among the mentors cited by Wormser in the book, Chalabi, Pearl, and Fife. The purpose of the unnamed intelligence unit, often described as a Pentagon quote-unquote cell, was to scour reports from the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and other agencies to find nuggets of information linking Iraq, al-Qaeda, terrorism, and the existence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, WMD. In a controversial press briefing in October 2002, a year after Wormser's unit was established, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld acknowledged that a primary purpose of the unit was to cull factoids which were then used to disparage, undermine, and contradict the CIA's reporting, which was far more cautious and nuanced than Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Fife wanted. Rumsfeld particularly enjoyed harassing the CIA staffer who briefed him every morning, using the type of data produced by the intelligence unit. Quote, what I could do is say, gee, what about this? Rumsfeld noted, or what about that? Has somebody thought of this? Unquote.
Oh, I wonder if Maloof enjoyed Rumsfeld dressing down this CIA.
Yeah, he didn't. Maloof didn't mention Rumsfeld, who I believe is long-term Republican. It was the Republican coup they'd set George W. Bush up for quote-unquote failure. All right, back to the article. Quote, last June, when Fife was questioned on the same topic at a briefing, he acknowledged that the secret unit, in fact, looked at the connection between Iraq and terrorism, saying, quote, you can't rely on deterrence to deal with the problem of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of state sponsors of terrorism because of the possibility that those state sponsors might employ chemical weapons or biological weapons by means of a terrorist organization proxy. Okay, I think there's missing a quote there, but okay. Though Fife in that briefing described Wormser's unit as an innocent project, quote, a global exercise, unquote, that was not meant to put pressure on other intelligence agencies or create skewed intelligence to fit preconceived policy notions. Many other sources assert that it did exactly that the White House and the Pentagon put enormous pressure on the CIA to go along with its version of events has been widely reported, highlighted by visits to CIA headquarters by Vice President Cheney and Louis Libby, his chief of staff. Led by Pearl, the neocons seethed with contempt for the CIA. The CIA's analysis, said Pearl, quote, isn't worth the paper it's printed on, unquote. Standing in a crowded hallway during an AEI event, Pearl added, quote, the CIA is status quo oriented. They don't want to take risks, unquote. That
right. Oh yeah, that's what Maloof's man. He Pearl worked under him, of course, going back to the Reagan days, I believe. And there's like I guess Pearl endorses Maloof's theories on the bunch of career professionals in the CIA.
Yep. Okay, quote, putting Wormser in charge of the unit meant that it was being run by a pro-Iraq war ideologue who'd spent years calling for a preemptive invasion of Baghdad and who was clearly predisposed to find what he wanted to see. Adding another layer of dubious quality to the endeavor was the man partnered with Wormser, F. Michael Maloof. Maloof, a former aide to Pearl in the 1980s Pentagon, was twice stripped of his high-level security clearances. Once in late 2001, interesting timing, and again last spring for various infractions. Maloof was also reportedly involved in a bizarre scheme to broker contracts between Iraqi officials and the Pentagon, channeled through Pearl, in what one report called a, quote, rogue intelligence operation, unquote, outside official CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency channels.
That makes me think. You once again, I think of Defense Intelligence Agency. I think of Michael Flynn, and you think like it sounds to me like there was a very similar, very similar to what Woolsey described as constantly, being undercut and I forget the term that was used there directly earlier with relation to what Woolsey said. What Maloof quoted Woolsey is basically undercutting and basically undermining. So you get this continuity here that sounds like very similar things were going on in the under the Obama administration with people such as a General Flynn, and it does seem to be once again just another continuity in terms of like the types of people that the evil deep state is maybe not putting the most investment and value into promoting the findings of and recommendations of. So.
All right, let me just read maybe one more or two more paragraphs here just to finish off the context. Okay, quote, as the momentum for war began to build in early 2002, Wolfowitz and Feith beefed up the intelligence unit and created an Iraq war planning unit in the Pentagon's Near East and South Asia Affairs section, run by Deputy Undersecretary of Defense William Lutey, under the rubric, quote, Office of Special Plans, unquote, or OSP. The new unit's director was Abram N. Shulsky. By then, Wormser had moved on to a post as senior advisor to Undersecretary of State John Bolton, yet another neocon who was in charge of the State Department's Disarmament, Proliferation, and WMD office and was promoting the Iraq war strategy there. Shulsky's OSP, which incorporated the Secret Intelligence Unit, took control, banishing veteran experts including Joseph McMillan, James Russell, Larry Hanauer, and Mary Beth McDevitt, who despite years of I bet they're all Democrats. Oh no, I'm sorry. Who despite years of service to NESA either were shuffled off to other positions or retired. For the next year, Lutey and Shulsky not only would oversee war plans, but would act aggressively to shape the intelligence product received by the White House. Both Lutey and Shulsky were neoconservatives who were ideological soulmates of Wolfowitz and Feith, but Lutey was more than that. He'd come to the Pentagon directly from the office of Vice President Cheney. That gave Lutey, a recently retired decorated Navy captain whose career ran from combat aviation to command of a helicopter assault ship, extra clout. Along with his colleague Colonel William Bruner, Lutey had done a stint as an aide to Newt Gingrich in 1996, and like Pearl and Wolfowitz was an acolyte of Wohlstetter's. Quote, he makes Ollie North look like a moderate, unquote, says the NESA veteran. And then it goes back into the background of Shulsky and Daniel working for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and Shulsky co-authoring a book on intelligence called Silent Warfare with Gary Schmidt, the Project for a New American Century, and whistleblower Lieutenant Colonel Kwiatkowski. So there's that. So we'll stop there for now and link to this article.
You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
Michael Maloof.
That was of course Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who along with Scoop Jackson seems to be the epitome of the good Democrats that this network of hawks really wants to see back. So.
Yep. So there was one other thing you wanted to address before we wrap up, Greg?
Yeah, I wanted to. I was thinking with regards to a majority of their conversation, particularly is that the conversation on Faultlines, particularly as it related to foreign policy and Putin's speech, was Belarus, which I'm not really well versed on Belarus, and then of course Ukraine, and I'm also likewise I'm not an expert on Ukraine either, like the history going on there, and there's with but what I do know is that particularly Lee Stranahan in this regard, and people like him, when they use the topic of Ukraine and regardless of where aspects of the truth begins and ends in terms of like the American foreign policy community's own complicity in ratcheting up the tensions and in terms of stoking conflict there. What I do know is that very much this topic of Ukraine has been used to basically to undermine and to attempt to really discredit any of the serious facts that are out there now, well-established information out there about the long-term history of, particularly the long-term history of Donald Trump, and in general, like a bigger conversation regarding combination of things that are going on domestically in terms of interference, as well as geopolitically, and things that Donald Trump did actually to, as far as like the Trump administration did to perpetuate certain matters geopolitically, such as the removal of America from aspects of the global stage, which of course we could argue about the positives and negatives of, but in this context, it's simply done to benefit this Russia geopolitically. And so I know that the Ukraine topic of Ukraine has been used particularly by Lee Stranahan too, and others like him. There are other people as well, but Stranahan has been a very, very well versed in this, and using Ukraine and this idea that all of the information about like Trump Russia is all hoax, and the real conspiracy is with Ukraine, and it's all a hoax, and the Russia stuff's a hoax created by like these Ukrainian Nazi, borderline neo-Nazi sympathizers who simply hate Russia and hate Putin. And I can tell you with absolute 100% confidence and belief that is, regardless of what's going on the ground in Ukraine and the ins and outs of like what the Nuland crew is up to, or what certain aspects are around Biden are up to, this is very much used to the Western aggression and the hawkishness towards Ukraine and the desire to undermine Russia in Ukraine is used to, on a number of levels, to push some very false propaganda, and it's also used to discredit any legitimate information that comes out regarding the long-term nature of the Trump dynamic as it relates to Russia and this global organized crime syndicate, as well as exactly what the likes of Paul Manafort and also were up to in Ukraine in the lead up to the election, as well as domestically with somebody like a Konstantin Kilimnik. And then also it extends into people such as Rudy Giuliani and their activities in Ukraine. So very much this idea of like the U.S. is simply just out to destroy Ukraine, or out to have its will in Ukraine just to hurt Russia, is used by the likes of Lee Stranahan as a smokescreen to just deflect away from any of like the serious fact-based information that's come out the last few years that the American establishment media that they love to rail against is perpetuating hoaxes has largely ran cover for, when you really look at the actual depths of what has and has not been reported accurately on or been reported on at all. So
yeah, and what happens in this case too is that the analysis is undone from the very get-go, because it ultimately will only ascribe covert operation, deception, interest operations to one side ultimately, which is what Stranahan does in terms of it's always the Americans and the West who are the ones who are running the deceptions and the covert operations, and Russia just sort of sits there, sort of taking it, and then takes in Yanukovych after the fact. And there's no way that Putin is any kind of active character in any of the. Has no sort of interest operations or deception operations.
He just wants to be left alone, and the Yankees won't leave him alone. But when Russia does exert its muscle geopolitically, it's being done to, it's like being done to like, they don't come out and say it, but it's being done to basically free the people of the third world from like the tyranny of American imperialism. The same thing with China, but the idea that nothing that is said about like Trump Russia or about the deeper aspects of like this global organized crime syndicate is can be trusted, because it's just been concocted by people who just simply want to do it for no other reason than just hating Russia and hating Putin for whatever reason. And also I think it was directly mentioned in the interview, but there's also this narrative coming out that it was that Biden announced his desire to have a summit with Putin, but then immediately starts sanctioning Russians, as if like the sanctioning of like these global very powerful, very influential oligarchs.
Bank counts matter,
yes.
Greg.
Yes, and this multinational gang of oligarchs, organized crime, etc., is like somehow a collective attack on the Russian people, just like how the narrative is out there that that holding the people accountable for like what led to Trump and everything resulting from that is a collective attack on 75 to 100 million conservative leaning Americans. And Jeremy, I wanted to see this. You had a great line you sent me earlier, and I want to find it real quick. You just had a great line. Oh, you had a great line. Messaged me earlier, said, "I don't find it that hard to be a transnational anti-imperialist while being an American patriot of conscience." And I love that term, a transnational anti-imperialist, meaning that we can be critical of what our own country's doing in these regards in terms of these operations, but at the same time, like, it doesn't mean that you become a cheerleader or start waving your pom-poms or start having this mentality that like anybody that is seen as being like an opposite to American foreign policy establishment for whatever reason is automatically like doing something good or is beyond scrutiny and criticism.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg. And it is the case that it's a difficult political line to walk or area to walk as independent, honest analysts. But it's so simple in terms of being honest and opposing the wrongdoing, no matter where it happens. And then we would say too, I think that strategically, that's why we keep on trying to get people to understand that if you are really an anti-imperialist, and that means all the way across the board, you're really anti-war, then you go to the root of the war on terror. And how it is that all of these different countries and leadership are utilizing the fraudulent rubric of the war on terror to increase their powers that operate in the realm of authoritarian, surveillance, torture, war, all these kinds of things. So it isn't not that difficult to be an anti-imperialist across the board. You just have to be honest and you have to have principles, and you can't just hope to sort of be like the enemy of my enemy is my friend or something like this, some kind of simplistic thing like that. And I would also point out that that's a losing proposition. Even if you think that the ends justify the means, it's a losing proposition. No, go to the root of the 21st century rubric, the war on terror. Go to especially if you're an American anti-imperialist, you talk plainly about September 11th, who did it and why, who's using the rubric and why all around the world to this day. All right. And so that's what we're going to do instead of playing, Putin Daca lives matter or something like that.
Yeah, it's especially useful when like a cut and dry, clear cut example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in this case, Russian state propaganda operating here in the West, putting on a primary propaganda architect of the operation of all of the events which led to this criminal, insane war in Iraq, which is the epitome of American foreign policy, and uses this platform on the crimes of like the post 9/11 American, carried out ultimately by American administrations. But then pinning it directly on those who were in opposition to his faction that he was directly affiliated with and was at the forefront of pushing this propaganda. And knowing that, and by the way, I'll say this real quick: the fact that that he doesn't bring their names up at all, or just completely obscures them from the record, like, just tells me. But especially when you've got a person like a Michael Maloof on air, knowingly being dishonest to say the least about who was behind the propaganda which got us into the war, and a matter of fact blaming the other side in partisanship for what a crew that he was directly affiliated with was largely responsible for, then you definitely need to move beyond just this simple idea of, and some of the anti-imperialists out there might be very interested to know and to understand the role of like a Michael Maloof and RT blaming people for what the crew directly affiliated with him was responsible for. So
yes, exactly. And, my final point would then be like to the American patriots of good intent out there, and those who are defensive of American interests, who operate either in or out of the American establishment, I would say y'all are going to have to deal with rooting out these treasonous wounds. I see no other way forward for the United States of America except through the difficult truths and accountability. There's no other way. There's no other way. I mean, you could try to patch something together, but it's so obvious how much we are wounded and made vulnerable ourselves, and by the same complex that helps provoke and push the worst, most violent criminal international acts that our government and has been involved in. So we're going to have to deal with that. All right. So everybody has a lot of accounting to do.
Yeah. Yep. And in terms of domestically, the domestic picture with the with the emphasis on domestic terrorism, and that the chances of that just really, we're not out of the woods in terms of some major domestic event to shape future narratives. And so even the people who want like accountability and justice for like the last 4+ years, like, you need to be versed on like these aspects, as the issue of domestic terrorism, quote unquote, continues to linger over us, and with potential for some serious actions to be taken in that. I think it's almost inevitable there will be some type of serious action or another taken in that with regards to that over the next few years. So it all comes back home as well. So.
All right. Well, until next time. AnteDote, we out.
Thank you very much.